In September of 1833, a ship called the Tuscany sailed up the Ganges River toward Calcutta, and the British colonists who came down to the docks to meet it could not believe what they were looking at. The ship had left Boston 4 months earlier and crossed 16,000 miles of open ocean around the southern tip of Africa through some of the hottest waters on the planet. And down in its hold, buried in sawdust and hay, was ice. Real ice. Solid blocks of frozen New England pond water, cut by hand in the dead of winter and hauled halfway around the world to a place where almost no living person had ever seen the stuff. The ship left Boston with 180 tons of it, and nearly everyone assumed every last ounce would melt into the bilge long before it reached India. They were wrong. More than 100 tons survived. And one local man, the story goes, laid his bare hand against a block of it, felt that deep burning cold bite into his fingers, and yanked his hand back, convinced he had been badly burned. He had no word for what he was feeling. He had never in his life touched anything frozen. To the people on that dock, ice was not a convenience. It was close to a miracle, because for almost the entire history of the human race, cold was the one luxury that money could not buy. You could be an emperor with every ounce of gold in your kingdom piled at your feet, and on a hot summer day you were exactly as sweaty and miserable as the poorest farmer in your fields. Gold could buy you anything except a cold drink in July. And the dessert sitting in your freezer right now, the one you scoop without a second thought, would have been, for most of human history, one of the rarest and most coveted luxuries on the face of the earth. But the story of ice cream does not begin on that ship. It begins in one of the hottest, driest places imaginable, more than 2,000 years ago, in the deserts of ancient Persia. In what is now Iran, the summer is merciless, the temperature climbing past 100 degrees and simply staying there. And yet, more than 2,000 years ago, the people of Persia figured out how to set something cold and sweet in front of their kings in the middle of all that heat. They built some of the most quietly brilliant structures of the ancient world, enormous domed buildings they called yakhchuls, which means ice pit. From the outside they looked like giant mud beehives swelling up out of the empty desert, but underneath each one ran a deep chamber with walls several feet thick. Insulated so cleverly that ice hauled down from the distant mountains in winter survived in the dark straight through the hottest months. They did not understand the physics of it. They had no word for thermodynamics. They were doing it anyway. What they made with that ice was the ancestor of everything that followed. They poured fruit syrups over the snow, sweetened it with honey, scented it with saffron and rosewater, and called the drink sharbat. Hold on to that word. And around 400 years before Christ, they made something closer still, a frozen dessert of thin, starchy noodles in a half-frozen syrup of rosewater and lime called falude, often named the first frozen dessert in all of human history. While most of the world was still chewing on plain snow, the Persians were eating something very much like a sorbet. And that word, sharbat, set off on a journey that outlived the empire that coined it. It became the Turkish sherbet, then the Italian sorbetto, then the French and English sorbet. Every single time you order a sorbet today, you are speaking a word that walked out of a Persian desert more than 2,000 years ago. The next great leap did not happen anywhere near the Mediterranean. It happened on the far side of the world, in China. Sometime during the Tang dynasty, between roughly 600 and 900 years after Christ, Chinese cooks did something nobody on earth had ever done before. They took milk, the milk of cows and goats and water buffalo, mixed it with flour and a fragrant substance called camphor, sealed the mixture into metal tubes, and lowered them into a freezing bath of ice and salt. What they pulled back out was the first frozen dairy dessert in the history of the world. Not flavored snow, not ice juice. Actual frozen milk, sweet and creamy and cold, served to Chinese emperors more than 1,000 years ago. This, right here, is the true grandparent of the thing in your freezer. Which brings us to the part almost everybody gets wrong. If you have ever heard anything about where ice cream came from, you have almost certainly heard that Marco Polo discovered it in China and carried the recipe home to Italy. It is a wonderful story, printed in countless books, and it is almost certainly a complete fabrication. Marco Polo never once mentions ice cream, or anything like it, anywhere in his writings about China, which is a very strange thing to forget if you had just tasted the best dessert of your life. The other favorite, that an Italian noblewoman named Catherine de' Medici brought ice cream to France in the 1500s, falls apart too. The dates do not line up, and the recipes did not yet exist. So, where did these charming little stories come from? They were mostly invented in the 1800s by ice cream sellers who wanted a romantic backstory to move their product. The truth is that ice cream had no single inventor at all. It was assembled, slowly, across thousands of years, by Persians and Chinese and Arabs and Italians, each one quietly adding a single piece. And one of those pieces, maybe the most important of all, came out of the Arab world. Arab scholars worked out a piece of science that sounds like absolutely nothing and changed absolutely everything. They discovered that if you mix ordinary salt into ice, the ice does not simply melt away, it gets colder, far colder. Salt drags the freezing point of water below zero and turns a bucket of ice into a slurry so cold it can freeze nearly anything you lower into it. By the 13th century, that knowledge was moving freely across the Arab world, and it was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle. Without it, the best you can do is chill a drink. With it, you can freeze a custard rock solid while you stir it perfectly smooth. This discovery seemed small at the time. It was not. It was the whole difference between a cup of flavored slush and true creamy ice cream, and it would sit silently at the heart of every ice cream maker built for the next 600 years. That knowledge crept into Europe through Sicily, which had been ruled for 2 centuries as an Islamic emirate and had soaked up the iced traditions of the Arab world. By the 1600s, Italy had become the beating heart of the frozen dessert world. Down in Naples, a man named Antonio Latini became the first human being we know of to write a recipe for sorbetto down on paper, including a version made with milk, the one most food historians point to as the first real ice cream recipe ever written. But for a long while, ice cream stayed locked behind palace walls and inside the homes of the obscenely rich, because making it demanded ice, and ice was rare and expensive. That began to crack open in 1686, in Paris, when a Sicilian named Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli opened a cafe he called Le Procope, which, remarkably, is still open today. For the first time, ordinary members of the public, at least the ones with coins in their pockets, could sit down at a table and order a frozen ice. Voltaire took his ices there. So, by some accounts, did a young soldier named Napoleon and a visiting American named Benjamin Franklin. Ice cream was finally stepping out of the throne room and onto the street. And yet that one enormous obstacle still stood between ice cream and the rest of us. Ice. You cannot freeze a custard without something cold to freeze it against. And for nearly all of human history, if you did not happen to live beside a mountain or a frozen lake, you could not get ice in the summer for any price at all. Cold remained the luxury money could not buy, which is exactly where one of the strangest businessmen who ever drew breath walks into our story. His name was Frederic Tudor, and in 1806, this young man from a wealthy Boston family announced a plan so absurd that people laughed at him to his face. He was going to soar ice out of the frozen ponds of New England in the depth of winter, load it onto ships, and sell it to people sweating half to death in the tropics, cold, shipped to the hot. His own family was convinced he had gone soft in the head. When his very first ship cleared the harbor bound for the Caribbean island of Martinique, the Boston newspaper ran a sneering little notice calling the whole affair a slippery speculation. The ice arrived in beautiful condition, and then not a single person bought it, because the people of Martinique had never seen ice in their lives and had no earthly idea what they were supposed to do with the strange melting blocks this lunatic had brought them. Tudor very nearly destroyed himself. He sank deep into debt. He was thrown into jail over money he could not repay. For years on end, the man history would eventually crown the Ice King was nothing but a punchline, but he was stubborn to the point of madness, and he understood one single thing that none of his mockers did. He was not selling ice. He was selling a craving people did not yet know they were capable of having. So he went to work manufacturing the demand. He taught bartenders how to mix a cold drink. He handed ice to cafes for free, eating the loss on purpose, because he had bet his life on a simple piece of human nature. Let a man taste something cold on a brutal hot day, just once, and he will never again be willing to live without it. Then, in the 1820s, a man named Nathaniel Wyeth rewrote the entire equation. Wyeth invented a horse-drawn plow that could carve ice out of a frozen pond in neat, identical blocks, slicing the whole surface of a lake into an enormous checkerboard. Suddenly, instead of a handful of men chipping away by hand, Tudor could harvest ice by the ton. His costs caved in, his business detonated. And that is how, in 1833, Frederic Tudor came to load 180 tons of ice onto the Tuscany and bet everything on a 4-month voyage to India, the very gamble we opened this story with. He won, and he won enormously. Over the next 20 years, the city of Calcutta alone earned him the equivalent of millions in today's money. Before long, he had ice houses standing ready in Havana, in New Orleans, in Charleston, in Bombay, in Singapore. By the years just before the Civil War, ice had climbed to become the second largest commodity shipped out of the entire United States by weight, second only to cotton. Frozen water, sawed out of ponds, was the second biggest thing this country shipped. But behind that empire was a cost nobody put in the advertisements. Cutting the ice was savage, dangerous work, armies of men out on frozen ponds in the killing cold. And a man who slipped through a cut seam into the black water below could be swept under the surrounding sheet and never come back up. Cold was still a luxury. It had just started being paid for by the people who would never taste it. If a man getting rich off of melting water is the kind of buried history you came here for, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. We dig stories like this up every single week, and the next few are going to be very good. Cheap ice changed everything. Once an ordinary family could buy a block of it in the summer, the only thing left standing between them and homemade ice cream was the labor of freezing it, and that labor was brutal. Stirring a mixture in a pot set down inside a bucket of ice and salt, scraping and beating the thing for the better part of an hour. In 1843, a woman named Nancy Johnson killed that problem, and she did it at a moment when American women had almost no legal claim to their own ideas at all. Across most of the country, a married woman could not own property or sign a contract in her own name. Nancy Johnson walked into the patent office and filed anyway, under her own name, for a device she called the artificial freezer, an inner canister to hold the cream, packed around with ice and salt, and a hand crank that turned a paddle to keep the mixture moving and smooth as it slowly froze. It is, right down to its bones, the very same machine you can still buy in a kitchen store today. And Nancy Johnson sold the rights to her patent for $200. The invention that would go on to put ice cream into millions of homes earned the woman who dreamed it up almost nothing at all. A few years later, a Baltimore milk dealer named Jacob Fussell, stuck with more cream than he could ever sell, froze it into ice cream instead of pouring it out, and opened what is generally remembered as the first ice cream factory in America. In that one moment, ice cream stopped being something you labored to make and became something you simply bought, mass-produced, and at last cheap enough for working people to afford. But the spread of cheap ice cream carried a genuinely dark shadow with it, and that shadow fell across the streets of Victorian London. There, Italian immigrants pushed little carts through the worst slums of the city, selling cheap scoops in a tiny glass cup, scarcely bigger than a thimble, called a penny lick. You handed over your penny, you licked the ice cream out of the little glass until it was clean, and then you handed the glass back. And the vendor, without washing it, without so much as wiping it, packed it with another scoop and passed it straight to the next customer. The same glass, all day long, passing from mouth to mouth to mouth, through the most crowded, most disease-ridden districts of the largest city on earth. You can already feel where this is going. The penny lick became a moving highway for sickness, in an age when tuberculosis was hollowing out the cities of Europe and cholera tore through the slums in waves. Doctors began to trace outbreaks of disease directly back to the penny lick. The same cold treat that put a flash of joy on the faces of the poorest children in London was, very quietly, helping to kill them. By the end of the 1890s, the penny lick was banned outright. And the problem it left behind, The problem of how to hand a poor man a scoop of ice cream without slowly poisoning him found its answer in one of the most beloved objects in the entire history of food, the cone. You could eat the container. There was nothing to hand back, nothing to pass on, nothing to wash, nothing to carry disease from one mouth to the next. The cone exploded into American life in 1904 at the World's Fair in St. Louis, where, as the legend goes, a vendor ran clean out of paper dishes on a blistering hot day, and a neighbor selling thin, crisp waffles rolled one into a cone for him to use instead. By the early 20th century, ice cream had stopped being a luxury or a curiosity entirely. In America, it was becoming something closer to a piece of the national identity, and nothing proves that quite so strangely as what happened during the Second World War, when ice cream stopped being a dessert at all and became, of all things, a genuine weapon of morale. The Navy had banned alcohol aboard all of its ships back in 1914, and ice cream slid neatly into the hole it left behind. Then, when Prohibition shut down every legal bar in the country, breweries actually switched to making ice cream just to keep their doors open. By the time the war came, the craving was carved straight into the bone. So the Americans took it to war with them, pouring such staggering amounts of money and effort into keeping the troops supplied that, in 1943, the single largest producer of ice cream in the entire United States was the United States Armed Forces. The enemy took notice of what it had come to mean. According to accounts from the period, Italy's dictator Benito Mussolini banned ice cream outright in his country, precisely because it had become such a glaring symbol of America. And the lengths the American military went to are almost impossible to believe. The Navy spent $1 million converting a concrete barge into a floating ice cream factory, then had it towed slowly around the Pacific to resupply ships too small to churn their own. It could turn out 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. Pilots got even more inventive, rigging cans of ice cream mix into the empty gun compartments and fuel drop tanks of their aircraft, then flying high enough that the freezing air and the rattle of the engines churned it into ice cream by the time they touched back down. On some ships, a downed pilot fished out of the ocean was worth 10 gallons of ice cream, paid by his grateful carrier to whichever destroyer hauled him out of the water. And no, that is not a figure of speech. And then there is the USS Lexington. In May of 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the aircraft carrier was hit by a storm of Japanese bombs and torpedoes and crippled past any hope of saving. As the order finally came down to abandon the burning listing ship, a group of her sailors broke into the freezers, scooped the ice cream out into their steel helmets, and ate every last bit of it as the Lexington went down into the Pacific beneath their feet. If they were going to lose the ship, they were not, under any circumstances, going to leave the ice cream behind. When the war finally ended, a Navy man named Bert Baskin, who had run an ice cream operation for the troops out in the Pacific, went into business with his brother-in-law, a man named Irv Robbins. The company the two of them built together, Baskin-Robbins, and its famous 31 flavors, grew straight up out of those wartime years. Today, ice cream is a global industry worth well over $100 billion a year, eaten on every single continent on the planet, including Antarctica, where the research stations keep a supply on hand against the cold. And the people who devour the most of it per person are not the Americans, as you might assume, but the people of New Zealand, who each put away somewhere around 60 pints of the stuff every single year. It has splintered into 1,000 forms: gelato in Italy, dense and slow churned; kulfi in India, simmered down thick and rich; mochi ice cream in Japan wrapped in soft, sweet rice dough; soft serve, swirling endlessly out of machines at roadside stands. And here is the part that should genuinely catch you off guard. Ice cream has even reached for outer space. A freeze-dried version was created for the space age, and it is still sold to this day as astronaut ice cream, the direct descendant of a Persian desert luxury, dried into a dusty, weightless brick light enough to ride a rocket off the planet. So stop for just a moment and look back down the long, strange road this thing traveled to reach your freezer. A frozen treat born in the desert palaces of ancient Persia, sweetened with saffron and chilled with snow carried down off the mountains, a creamy version sealed into metal tubes for the emperors of China. A quiet piece of Arab chemistry that made the whole thing physically possible. A milk sorbet scratched onto paper by a cook in Naples. A half-mad Bostonian who got rich, shipping melting ice across the oceans on the frost-bitten hands of men who drowned in the dark to cut it. A woman who patented the very machine that spread it and was paid almost nothing for her trouble. A glass cup that carried both joy and disease through the slums of London. A wartime weapon of morale that sailors ate from their helmets as their ships sank under them. No king invented it. No explorer ever carried it home in his saddlebags. It was built by thousands upon thousands of hands across thousands of years, each one adding a single cold, sweet piece, and not one of them ever got to taste the finished thing the way you can, for about $3. On a hot afternoon, cold was the one luxury money could not buy, and so the human race spent 2,000 years learning how to buy it anyway. It outlasted emperors. It bankrupted and then enriched a madman. It went to war and came home a hero. And tonight, it is sitting quietly in your freezer, humming in the dark, waiting for you to open the door.